Yeah, my journey in this field began quite early. While I was still at school, I could see the injustices that was happening, particularly with my friend. And then I certainly saw from my own perspective, my mother suffered some issues, mental health issues, with the divorce of my father, and the kind of discrepancy that women and the lack of support that women get, and then the lack of the educational system to support children going through that, and how that can compound to really significant issues. So I followed that on, becoming a studying filmmaking at university, and my interest in social impact filmmaking led me to work in the film industry and make some contribute to some significant Australian documentary films. And then I went to work in later in vulnerable communities. I introduced some programs that we'll have a chance to talk about, and saw the phenomenal effect of this very holistic, simple way of working with parents and children. And that work led me to writing some books, and then what we're here to discuss, my film, my social impact documentary film, The Infinite Game, Preparing Young People for an Uncertain Future.
In your early work with vulnerable families, your aim was to strengthen the parent-child relationship. Could you tell us what the key aspects of this work was?
Yes, the key was to simplify parenting. In vulnerable families, they've got multiple stresses, and which have often been in the past and also in the present. So the act of raising children can be a very complex thing with a lot of stress and anxiety. So the programs that I devised and ran and facilitated the running of in these communities was really to strip away the essence of complication, and really coming back to that nurturing, loving, nurturing bonds, and how to create that. And that was by numbers of things, removing all external stimuli, um, really um, losing all the plastic toys. We came into a centre that had just spent $2,000 on plastic toys, new toys, and my facilitator there, the Aboriginal facilitator, said, right, they're staying in the cupboard. We're just going to have very simple handmade toys, wooden blocks, baskets, shells, rocks. And what happened was extraordinary. The change in the well-being of the children was instantaneous. There was no screaming, no shouting, no fighting, where previously, the previous week, when they'd had this external stimuli, they were fighting. Everything was going chaotic. And people around this boardroom where the centre was being run opened their doors going like, we want to hear the children play. They were playing happily and cooperatively with each other. And then we built in things like health and nutrition through baking bread, singing songs, art and craft. And of course, most importantly, what happens with many families is a lack of rhythm. So helping them bring in that sense of rhythm to create that sense of harmony, both for the children, but also for the parents. The parents had a sense, I know what's going to happen next. I know what I need to do next. It was magical, absolutely magical.
How could a more holistic approach to education, one that reduces focus on academic outcomes and foster creativity, have on both the mother and the child?
Huge. When children are happy, and learning skills, like I mentioned in the program, for the children to actually be engaged in free imaginative play, and imagination and creativity is what is innate within all of us. We all have these gifts. And as Ken Robinson said in his talk, do schools kill creativity? That so often is educated out of us. So once the child has that creative spirit and is eager and curious about learning and engaging with things, and they can, as they become older, they can become engaged for longer periods of time, then there's less stress for the parents because they can see that their child is actually developing into someone who's really in love with learning and with life. And here in Australia, and from what I've heard across Europe, and particularly in the UK, the school refusal rates are now at around almost 50%. There's a huge crisis going on, and that makes a huge amount of stress all the way through the family because the system's not working, as we know, for these amazing children, who all children are amazing.
So, Jane, you mentioned earlier that you've seen the implementation of holistic methods in Finnish schools. Could you tell us more about what you've seen in the Finnish education system?
Yes, what was fascinating for me to go there, why I wanted to go there, and what was fascinating for me was to talk to the people behind the curriculum development, because not only has Finland adopted a very arts craft holistic approach, but no standardized testing, but it also has very high academic achievements. For very early on it was leading the top of the PISA testing. So it really was, for me, a example that could be shown to the world, and many people know about the Finnish education, that these two, creativity, arts and craft, are not separate from academic achievement. In fact, the research that Anne Banford has done in her book, The Wow Factor, just goes to show that when you bring arts and craft and creativity into the curriculum, everything improves, the children's health, well-being, and their academic performance. And it's so important, that creative thinking. And this is why UNESCO and OECD are interested in it. But the big question, the $64,000 question, is how to implement that in ways that is truly allowing children's own creativity and uniqueness to come through. And also, one of that uniqueness is the fact that the schooling starts only at the age of 7, 6 going on 7. And as one of the people from the Ministry of Education, my film says, everything is based in Finnish education on research, and they've done their research, and there's no difference between children who start at 6.5, 7, as opposed to children who learn to read earlier. All children have the same outcomes by the time they're 10. So this idea that a child should be reading at 3 or 4 is going to be another Einstein is also a myth that can cause a lot of stress for parents. And if they knew that, they could kind of go like, no, my child's involved in creative activities, creative play, sport even is part of that, time out in nature, then the child is happy, the parent is not under pressure to make the child perform to these unrealistic outcomes and goals that have been have crept into the equation.
Yeah.
I've seen data as well. The rates of anxiety disorders and depression have skyrocketed in recent years, driven by social media. There's no question about that.
We've done quite a few social media studies where we just have looked at things like self-esteem in teenagers and body image satisfaction, acknowledging that what is happening in teen brains, when there is some sort of trigger that maybe sets off that adrenaline cortisol response, that it looks like in the brain an addiction to something like cocaine or heroin.
Well, I think it's really critical. Here in Australia, with social media, the government is proposing a ban on social media for under 16-year-olds. Now, as we know, that's not going to be totally effective. Young people can find their way around these. But what it sends the message to parents is that actually there is a kind of a benchmark of where social media is acceptable. Now, when I spoke with Stephen Shearer, the ex-CEO of Facebook Australia, New Zealand, in my film, he just said, well, maybe it should be 21, maybe it should be 18, and maybe 16, but certainly it potentially could even be older than that, because one of the other visionaries I spoke to was Professor Peter Stapleton, a clinical and health psychologist, and she says the studies of people addicted to social media, when they look at their brain, it looks like somebody addicted to cocaine or heroin. So it's, and that goes across the board. That's not just young people, that's all people. So in fact, how we interact with social media needs to be really much more deeply examined. Controls obviously need to be put in place. And yes, it is a way that young people can communicate, but the amount of cyberbullying and other things is just rising exponentially. And young people can't control that.
This is the mindfulness pose. I take some breaths, close my eyes, and listen for sounds. I feel calm and not distracted. It's just mostly useful when we're sad or angry or need some alone time.
The film, you had this beautiful scene of a young school child in Australia describing how these meditation techniques help her manage her anxiety. And for a child this young, what role do you think mindfulness plays in helping children manage their anxiety?
Mindfulness is, the school that I've visited in, which was during the pandemic, in Perth in Western Australia, Lake Gwelup Primary School, was for children from 5 to 12 years old. And there they described anxiety, and the last 5 years had become the newest learning disorder, which they were horrified that they were spending more time, virtually a day a week, dealing with children with really high levels of anxiety across the board, with children as young as 5 coming in and showing signs of depression. So they brought in a whole school mindfulness and meditation program, and just to help the children learn to focus on their breathing, their thoughts, to know that they have the capacity within their own being to control where their mind goes, or let their mind go into a state of emptiness and space, or a place of pleasure. There's a beautiful moment in the film when think of something beautiful and the teacher says, oh, I can see these beautiful smiles on the children, and they have these beaming. So children have that capacity to move quite quickly, and if they're given these tools, that they can then utilize them. Another example with 2 boys who are skateboarding, and they use that. They were 9-year-olds, and they go to skateboarding competitions, and they use mindfulness before their skateboarding competitions, because they say if you don't land it well, it hurts. So it's better to have that practice. And what that had happened was it allowed the parents who had some years prior engaged in mindfulness and meditation to reintroduce that as a conversation piece in the family. So the parents were so grateful the school had introduced it, and they can go, right, now we can talk about that, practice some mindfulness. I also wanted to say that working with schools like Montessori and Steiner, their responses are that mindfulness is integrated into the whole of the curriculum. The way that things are done in mindful ways, and which is why people report it's often very calming and very therapeutic for children. So there are different ways. There's the mindfulness as a program, but there's the mindfulness as integrated into the curriculum and the practices and the environments.
So, what kind of impact do you think mindfulness and meditation practices like this could have in supporting mothers with their own mental health and well-being?
It can be huge. The expanding from the mindfulness and meditation, there's online training programs, but even if even a 5 or 10 minute breathing exercise can actually just calm the whole nervous system down. And once that's calm, then everything shifts in the family. So the family and the mother's well-being is critical for how everything then evolves into the rest of the family. So learning breathing techniques, learning mind calming techniques, learning meditation techniques is absolutely crucial. I think in this day and age, we live in such a distracted and busy society. The online world is constantly clamoring for our attention, as I've heard in different conferences, media conferences, it's not only our attention, they call us eyeballs. We want the eyeballs moving from one screen to the other. I was going like, I'm horrified. And they get
like
really
that.
excited. Excited at the idea of the child reaching their hand through the screen, going, yes, we've got this child now totally in our grasp. And my passion is to go, yes, certainly the internet and screens and media have a huge role to play in our lives, and hence this podcast, wonderful session that we're having, but they also need to be mediated by our own consciousness and our own understanding of capacity to understand who we are and then engage on those terms with boundaries. And children need people to put boundaries in place for them.
I think based on everything we've discussed today, something that jumps out to me is investing more in mothers and family. What would investing in mothers look like to you?
We've talked a bit about this, and I think what we've discussed is that support needs to come early before children come in. That's when mothers have time to take on new ideas and learn new skills, and then as the child arrives, to feel that they are empowered to simplify. And I think support groups, there's both information online, but then there's nothing like the real support group of 5 to 7 mothers getting together, being led in groups like we did with the songs and games and craft was just magical. These parents, you could just feel them breathing out, connecting with each other, learning new songs to sing, nurturing, healing their own childhood as part of that. And we've all had traumas in our childhood, and to have those environments. So investing in deconstructing what actually makes a healthy childhood and simplifying that. I'm, as you can hear, very strong on the environments, the health and nutrition, the connection to nature, and a connection to each other. All of these things are so critical, yet often they get health and nutrition is put on one side and connection to nature and all these art and craft. But in fact, they are all interlinked, and they are so powerful when they are all combined. Is the whole of this greater than sum of the parts, the beautiful saying.
Singing into harmony. We are one big